Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to the third in our series of Clyde.Scot Clyde Sustainable Shipping webinars. My name is Ian McGilvray. I'm the Executive Director of CDPI, the Clyde Docks Preservation Initiative. And my colleague Liz Gardiner and I will be hosting the guest panelist presentations and discussion session today. We're delivering a series of webinars this year in the run-up to the COP26 Climate Change Conference in Glasgow in November, which at the moment we're still cautiously optimistic will be going ahead. These webinars are focused on reducing emissions from shipping and what the opportunities there are in that for the Clyde. We're also setting up a working group to look at the issues relevant to developing sustainable shipping on the Clyde, and we've appointed an independent chair for that. And if you'd like to find out more, or if you have expertise that you could contribute to the working group, please get in touch using the contact information I'll put on screen at the end. And this is the webinar schedule. The first webinar looked at sustainable propulsion and retrofit technology, as well as setting the scene for the webinar series and our aims in looking at sustainable shipping. And in the second session, we looked at infrastructure operations. And the recordings of those are now available on the Clyde.Scot YouTube channel, and they'll be added to a webinar review section on the Clyde.Scot website soon. This morning is the second of the two webinars looking at infrastructure, and our next session, postponed from March, is on Tuesday the 11th of April, and that will be looking at vessel design and build, and we'll be announcing the panellists and opening the delegate bookings for this on Eventbrite in the next few days. Today we're looking at infrastructure development and investment, and I'm now going to hand over to Liz to introduce our guest panellists.
Thanks very much, Ian. Good morning, everybody. My name is Liz Gardiner. I'm the Secretary of CDPI. I'm a cultural planner, and I'm particularly interested in how we can use our cultural resources, and in particular how artists can make a difference in helping us to use our cultural resources going forward. So I'm particularly interested in Clyde Docks Preservation Initiative's plans for a festival celebrating our cultural resources along the River Clyde. So this morning, it's my great pleasure to introduce, first of all, Edvard Molitor, who's the Head of Sustainability at Gothenburg Port Authority, which is Scandinavia's largest port and one of the world's leading ports in environmental matters. He leads on strategic environmental management, is responsible for the sustainable development of the port through the implementation of environmental permits and international requirements, and is well known in the international port community. From 2017 to 2020, he chaired the Sustainable Development Committee of European Seaports, and he is now Vice Chair of the Climate and Energy Committee in the International Association of Ports and Harbours. With an MSc in Aquatic and Environmental Engineering from Uppsala University in Sweden, Edvard Molitor has a wide international experience of environmental management, sustainable development, maritime operations, and marine pollution responses, with experience at SSPA Sweden, at the European Maritime Safety Agency, EMSA, and at the Swedish Coast Guard headquarters. Over to you, Edvard, and thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. I'll try and give you a picture of how it's like to drive the port development and the sustainability work within the Port of Gothenburg. And I'll share a slide here. I hope you can see it now, otherwise let me know. Port of Gothenburg is the largest port in Scandinavia. We're a full service port, so it's a wide variety of things that we work with, which makes this task of keeping it sustainable quite challenging sometimes. But I'll try and give you a view of what type of issues that we work on at this time. To start with, what is the scene that we're working in Port of Gothenburg? Well, Sweden is highly dependent on exports. And actually, we have 50% of Swedish container traffic passing through the Port of Gothenburg. So the country is dependent upon us. We have a very large range of liner services, and we're actually the only port in Scandinavia that can receive the world's largest ocean-going vessels. And that puts a lot of effort to that specific part of our business. And we also have a very large share of the exports passing by rail to go to the land side. And we are more and more looking at ourselves not only as a port, but as a transport hub. We need to remember that the land side is equally important for a port as the seaside is. Traditionally, we've looked almost always towards the sea, but today we look towards the land side as well. We are also the energy hub of the Nordic region, and we have a very large energy port. That's kind of challenging because with the switch in energy resources that we're seeing in the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to have to replace a large amount of oil, roughly 20 million cubic meters of oil passing through the port, with something else. And we don't know exactly what yet. We do know that we need to be digitalized and we need to look at new types of technology and innovative ways to solve this. Otherwise, we cannot fulfill our goal, which is to guarantee the access to the world for the Swedish industry. Now, the Port of Gothenburg has been around for almost exactly 400 years. We're actually 1 year older than the city because the port was established 1 year before the city was. And in these 400 years, a lot has happened. On the right-hand side, you see a small sailing vessel. It's a replica of the vessel Gothenburg, which was one of the vessels that went back and forth to East India back in the days. Now, what that vessel and its sister ships did in 110 years of the East India Company is less goods than what you can today put on one single vessel. So there's a huge difference in size and in amount of goods. Unfortunately, there is the same difference in environmental footprint. So with the sailing vessels, there was a very small footprint on the environment. With these giant vessels that we have today, we do have a large environmental footprint and also a large impact on the climate, which means that we need to do something about this. If we look at the Port of Gothenburg and the various areas, like many other ports, we've had to move the actual port areas. If you look at the right-hand side in the lower corner, you see a little arrow saying city center. That is downtown Gothenburg. That was where the main port was located 400 years ago. And it was actually just that. Eventually, in the few hundred years that have passed, more and more of the port areas have moved from the city center to the outskirts of the city, taking larger and larger areas into account. Today, we have logistic areas, refineries, clusters of all kinds, looked upon as part of the port. So the port is a totally different thing today than it was 200 or 300 years ago. And of course, all of this needs to be treated in some sort of effective way. What we can see as well is that the only parts that are still left in the city center and close to the cities or to the citizens is Stena Line and the cruise terminal. Stena Line because they have passengers, and the passengers don't really like to travel that far from the city center. They want to be close when they are boarding the vessel. Although we're already seeing attempts to move also this traffic to the outskirts of the city, removing thereby more or less the last part of the actual port operations from the city center to the outskirts. And as a port authority, we actually tend to think that that's a good thing, because it's a lot easier to run a port in the outskirts of the city than it is in the city center, due to the environmental footprints, due to the emissions, and due to the noise issues. Like many others, we've put a very ambitious climate goal, and I think that was one of the main reasons as well that we were invited to speak here. A couple of years ago, we decided to have a climate goal not just for the port, but for the entire port area and beyond. We decided that our climate emissions are going to go down by 70% before 2030. We use the base year 2010, and we actually include all sea and land traffic within the greater Gothenburg area, which means we include the fairway and we include the trucks and the trains that leave the port area. Everything that is emitted within the greater Gothenburg area, which is related to goods passing through the port, should be included in this climate goal. That is what makes it so challenging, because we're actually trying to change the behavior of others than just ourselves. We need to change the behavior of our customers as well. Because when we look at the climate emissions within the port, we've actually come quite far already. We reached a 70% reduction already in 2020, and this was mainly done by switching to HVO, hydrated vegetable oil, a biofuel, in our machinery park. So while we are already more or less fossil free, we still have to do the next step, because these vessels and these machinery parks are still emitting various NOx and SOx and air emissions. So we need to go the next step. We need to electrify. And electrification is really the key word when it comes to sustainability in the port area, because we need to electrify a large chunk of the operation still. If possible and if needed, we might also include hydrogen-based solution, but then we need access to hydrogen. We don't have that today, and we don't know exactly how that would be produced. So then we're coming back to this energy balance of energy sources and resources and how to use them. But what we see at this time is that we've come a long way. This makes us a good basis for trying to convince others to do their part. You always have to make your own homework first before trying to convince others. One example of what we're doing at this time that we haven't done still is to electrify our port security vessel. Like many other ports, we have a port security vessel. We also use it for inspections. We use it for visits. So if you ever get a chance to visit the Port of Gothenburg in reality, I'll take you on a tour on this vessel. This port inspection vessel is 40 years old. And of course, it's fairly dirty diesel engines. So we started talking about replacing it with an electric vessel. But in the end, we decided we don't have to replace this vessel. We can actually retrofit it with electric propulsion and battery. We still think we need a diesel electric backup system because of security reasons. But deciding on retrofitting instead of new build saves us a lot more emissions. A new hydrogen or electric vessel does not necessarily have to be one of those fancy modern ones. It can be these old style, very practical vessels. It can still be environmentally friendly. But we also have to do something about the land side. Like I said, we're watching more and more towards the land side. We need to do something about the emissions from the trucks and the trains. We reached pretty far. We actually have a 28% reduction in 2020 in comparison to 2010. And this has been reached by switching again to biofuels and more electricity. But in order to reach even further, we need support and we need cooperation. We need to work with the truck companies so that there are available trucks that can run on cleaner fuels. And we also need to make sure that it's economically feasible to run a truck on a cleaner fuel. It cannot be too expensive. But of course, best of all would be to transfer more goods from road to rail. We already today have a 60% share of containers going by rail instead of by road, but we can increase that even further because the railway traffic is by far the cleanest mode of transport if it's electrified. Then, of course, we have the vessels, and the vessels traditionally run on the dirtiest of all fuels, heavy fuel oil. So here there's a lot of work to be done. First of all, we've been looking at the quay side. And here's something that we've been working for a long time within Gothenburg. And when I say a long time, I mean 20 years. By international standards, that is a long time. That we've been looking at onshore power supplies. Onshore power supply is basically hooking up to the electrical grid instead of running your auxiliary engines when you're at quay. This lowers the emissions at berth, and we use this for all the Ro-Ro and Ro-Pax calls to Port of Gothenburg, which is roughly a third of the ship calls. And we continuously do develop new connections. We are looking now at connecting a number of tankers as well. But it's very important to remember here that using electricity at quay for vessels is useful in some quays, but not all quays. It's important to connect where it makes sense, not at every quay. And why am I saying this? Because the European Parliament is continuously discussing to put a regulation in place where they ask everybody to connect every quay, which means we would actually pay for a lot of installments that would rarely be used, because you have to look at quays. How often are vessels there? How often can these vessels actually connect? We do not want to invest in a lot of connections that would never be used. And this is something that you got to keep in mind when talking about how to get the regulators on board, because the regulators, we started trying to convince them to actually ask more of us to connect to onshore power supply. But then they thought it would be a good thing to connect everybody all the time. And that's not the case. So you need to be careful when working with the regulators to get the right amount of pressure. Of course, we would prefer not to having to connect to onshore power supply. We would prefer to have alternative fuels, like it's called today. Vessels should be shifting from heavy fuel oil to something else. The question is what? Development has so far been fairly slow, but it's expected to pick up pace at right about now, because we see more and more ship owners shifting to new type of fuels. We have a lot of options ahead, and there's ups and downs to all of these. A lot of shippers favor the batteries and fuel cells for the short distance, and ammonia or methanol for the long distance, still using combustion engines. And some even discuss wind propulsion and call this innovative technique. I find that fairly funny, considering that wind technique, I think, has been around for quite a while. What we need to remember here is that there will be opportunities arising on a whole new market. I was just recently talking to some scientists and connections on the international port area. And when it comes to energy hubs, like Port of Gothenburg, we tend to think that we're sort of safe in that we will be the energy hubs also in the future, because we are so today. But when we're going to replace 20 million cubic meters of oil with electricity or hydrogen or something else, it's not necessarily the best business case to put it in Port of Gothenburg. We could see other port areas and other actors popping up like mushrooms everywhere, taking over the business. So it's going to be a really tough market when switching from the existing fossil fuels to new types of fuels. And it's not necessarily going to be the same winners in the future. And by that, we also need to remember that we need to avoid stranded assets, because a lot of discussion is also ongoing, especially within the European Union, about large investments, for example, for LNG, liquefied natural gas. Some say this is going to be the fuel of the future also for another 20 or 30 years. Others say that this is going to go up and then down, and you're going to be having stranded assets if you invest too much in handling a type of fuel, which is not going to be the favor of the next 2 or 3 years or 10 or 20 years. We don't know. So a lot of question marks when it comes to alternative fuels. Then, of course, it's not just the fuel infrastructure. We also need the basic infrastructure, the concrete at the bottom, the area we actually build the port upon. And we need to have more of this area. We're moving out from the city center, and we need to expand in new areas. So what we're doing at the moment actually is that we're filling up this little bay that you see on the picture there on the right-hand side. We're going to fill this bay and we're going to build new terminal area on top of it. And we're going to do this by using dredging spoils, because we actually have this little issue of too much tributyl-10 anti-fouling in the dredged spoils that we bring up when dredging the river. This is old since, of course, from way back when the hull paints contained TBT, and therefore we cannot dump these dredged spoils anywhere. So what we're doing then is that we're actually reusing it. We're putting it into this bay, in a way using it as a circular material. Of course, this is innovative, which means it's also quite challenging. You need to do it in a safe manner. And there's a slight problem as well when it comes to nature and habitats, because within this bay, there's a lot of eelgrass, and that eelgrass is going to disappear. So in order to stay environmentally friendly, and also as obeyed by the environmental court, we have to replace that eelgrass somewhere else. So what we're doing at the moment is that we're actually planting 1.7 hectares of eelgrass. Planting grass is actually planting it straw by straw with divers. So it's a fairly tough operation. Next is going to be also introducing emission-free constructions, and this has to be done through procurement stipulations. So we need to work in all ends to make sure that these developments are done in a way that is climate friendly. So we're basically a very wide variety of things that we can do, but all kept together by looking at the actual balance of the project. Then, of course, when I said hull paint is better today, that also meant that water quality, traditionally a very important question for ports, sort of came out of the fashion. We haven't really looked at water quality as a top issue for the last 10 to 20 years. Bottom hull paints are better, the handling of ballast water is better, but then came around the sulfur rules. First, within the SECA, which is the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, but now we have sulfur restrictions in all parts of the ocean. One way of solving this is to continue to use heavy fuel oil with sulfur content, but then to scrub the exhaust fumes with a scrubber. The problem is that the wash water from this scrubber technique is let out into the water body, and that contains heavy metals and all kinds of various particles. So water quality quickly stepped back into the light and is now one of the more important issues for port. So what we need to remember here is basically that when we have all these environmental challenges and climate challenges, we cannot solve one issue by introducing another potential problem. What we did here was that we solved the air emission problem and we created a water quality problem. We really need to avoid doing that again. Instead, what we need to do is take care of our old sins. Previously, when we had nowhere to put dredged material, we put it in a pile right next to a very valuable bird area. Now, this was a pile of dredged spoils for a long time, but what we've done in the last 3 to 4 years is that we've covered this dredged material, which was contaminated, with a clean clay. And on top of that, we built a wetland, which means that what was previously just a dump area is nowadays a wetland for fowl and a very important, valuable bird area. Thereby, we can move towards having a cleaner connection to nature right next to the port. And most ports are close to nature. We do have this type of bird valuable areas close by in most cases. So we really need to balance our environmental footprint and take this into account. It's important. So to conclude, I would say that my recommendations is that we need to keep an eye out for stranded assets. There's a quickly changing development and we need to make the right choices so that we don't end up with stranded assets. One needs to keep all aspects in mind so as not to go into a dead end. do not build something which will not be used. We need to keep nature close, and we need to value the port heritage. Like all ports, we of course have our own fortress right at the entrance. You can see on the picture there, which defended us very poorly, unfortunately, against the Danes way back when, but at least we tried. We do need to think long term. Not everything can be paid off in the first year. So if we look at the bigger picture, we need to remember that what we're doing for environment and climate, and not necessarily for the payoff. And of course, we need to remember, if we can, we should reuse and upgrade before we invest in new builds. Not everything when it comes to new fancy fuels has to be the latest fashionable thing. We can reuse the old stuff and we can do it properly. By that, I would like to say thank you very much, and I hope the Port of Gothenburg will be a valuable port also in the next 400 years. Thanks.
Thank you, Edvard. I was smiling when you talked about this innovative technology called wind, when you Swedes have been building beautiful sailing ships way back in the day. So thank you so much for that. That was fascinating. Next, we've got Samuel Lee, who's the business unit manager of the Scottish Marine Technology Park for the Malin Group. Sam is an ex-marine engineering submariner, serving on UK submarines based in Plymouth, UK. After leaving the Navy in 2014, Sam worked in various project management roles, from defence to the UK wastewater industry, joining Malin Group in 2017 as a project manager within Clean Ship Solutions. Sam joined the Scottish Marine Technology Park project in July 2019 as business unit manager, responsible for overall delivery of the SMTP. The aim of the business is to transform the current brownfield site into an innovation hub for the marine industry in Scotland and beyond. Currently, the project has funding to reinstate the critical key infrastructure, which will unlock the land behind it for future tenants to have unfettered access to the deep water channel of the River Clyde. And to tell us about the exciting prospects for the future, welcome Sam Lee.
Thanks. I'll share this. Gonna have to move all of your faces out of the way, sorry. Okay, thanks everyone. And thanks for the intro, Liz. As she said, ex-RN submariner with various kind of roles in project management. And when I joined Malin Group, this project was kind of rumbling under the surface. And then I stuck my head above the parapet and showed a bit too much interest in it. So now I ended up running it and responsible for delivering it. So I'll give you a brief overview of what we're trying to do. It's a fairly innovative and pretty large project to kind of squeeze into 15 minutes, but I'll try and touch on the key points, why we're doing what we're doing, where we want to go, and how we see this as kind of not the port of the future, but more of the way that things could be done in the future going forward as we look to kind of regenerate brownfield sites around Scotland and the UK. So the SMTP is part of Malin Group. Malin Group's been around for over 100 years now, based right on the banks of the River Clyde in the famous South Rotunda building. So there's two rotundas north and south of the Clyde, and it harks back to the days when we used to have ships coming up and down the Clyde. You couldn't put bridges in the way. So there's a tunnel under that building that runs directly under the Clyde and comes up the other side. Our side is offices, fairly nice offices, I might add, with a climbing wall and all the modern facilities you'd expect. And on the other side is a restaurant. But Malin Group's kind of prime reason for being is we offer turnkey solutions to ship owners and manufacturers. So we was involved heavily in the aircraft project where we were shipping pieces of the aircraft around the UK for it to be constructed in Rosyth. And we're involved in many offshore kind of projects, ranging from the small things to delivering 200-300 ton units offshore. With all of that work and with our involvement with kind of the likes of BAE and the MOD, our order book is expanding. So we look to expand. I think it was 2016, 2015, we're looking to expand onto the Clyde and kind of keep our heritage on the Clyde. we couldn't find anywhere where you could buy a plot of land that had access to the river, either be it just at the quay or actually with a quay, until we found the plot of land that I'll talk about today down at Old Kilpatrick. So these are some of our clients that we've worked with. As I mentioned, kind of offshore and military heavy. So these guys seem to be the ones that want the heaviest bits of equipment shipped around the world. So we tend to get more involved with these. And this is a build-up of our organization. So you have Malin Group Properties as the owner of the land, Malin Group as the overall company, and then these smaller businesses facilitate the wider Malin Group aim of building large pieces of fabrication for offshore and military use and shipping it around the world. So the Scottish Marine Technology Park. So we own 47 acres of brownfield land on the banks of the River Clyde. We're nestled between Erskine Bridge and Glasgow city centre. So real prime location, and it's right on to the deep water channel of the Clyde, which again, as we said, we searched high and low and we couldn't find anywhere suitable for our needs. We've looked to purchase the land to expand, and then in doing that, we had stipulations on when purchasing. We originally wanted to purchase a small part of the land, and the stipulation was you buy the whole thing or you buy none. So we took on the 47-acre project, and internally that made us think we're quite an innovative company and we're quite forward thinking in the first place. And by owning that much land with access to the quay and our own experience of trying to get key infrastructure to expand our business, there was a general feeling that there must be another need for this in the wider kind of Scottish marine industry. So what else could we do? So we've designed the park on the basis of a circular economy and delivery of large projects. So you would, in hope, land a small SME who could then grow as the projects start coming in, and there'd be many sites on the wider site that they could move into and expand into, all with access to the quay. So the pun kind of kicking around the office at the minute is the quay is key. It unlocks all of the land behind it, and that's where we see the real value. So our vision's pretty bold. We'd like to innovatively create new, sustainable, high quality green jobs in the Scottish maritime manufacturing and technology sector, and deliver wealth creation into both the local community and Clyde as a whole. I'll touch on the history because the history is kind of driving where we need to go. We spoke about this right at the start, that Clyde Bank in Glasgow was famous for shipbuilding. That's where, you know, Glasgow was built on the riches of the shipbuilding. I think the stats something crazy like 1 in every 4 or 3 ships was built on the Clyde during kind of the late Victorian, mid-Victorian era. So that was the bread and butter. But there was also this site. So our site is this piece here that you can see. It's the old Royal Fleet Auxiliary Fueling Depot. So it was critical in World War One for refueling all the RFA ships, and obviously it's critical in World War Two. And as such, in World War Two, during the Clydebank Blitz, it was targeted extensively, as we've found out through our site investigations. So the early part of its history was supporting the war effort, and then later into the 20th century, it became more of a traditional oil refinery. So with you can see kind of this thick black line, that's the canal, and that was used to ferry goods up and down and supply the depot. And also there's an oil pipeline from Grangemouth to the site. So this was a real crucial hub on the West Coast, especially during the war, because it enabled ships to refuel and then go back out to the Atlantic to do multiple runs, either civilian or military. So it's always been a crucial site, and we're looking to kind of keep it as that, less war influenced and more kind of industry and innovation influenced, and be kind of that key centerpiece on the west coast of Scotland. As I said, we've had our issues by buying an old oil refinery and all the problems that you'd expect to come with it. So being an ex-marine engineer and wanting things in layman's terms, I naively asked the environmental guys to do me a map and show me how bad it was and where the bad stuff is, and highlight it in kind of red, amber and green. And you'll notice there's not a lot of green. There's a lot of amber, which is actually not that bad, and then red and black. So we've, as Malin, spent a lot of money to kind of develop this picture and understand where the brownfield land needs regeneration, where it doesn't, and how that's going to kind of feed into the development picture. The good thing is the contamination is oil, as bad as that sounds. It's very thick, so it doesn't move unless it gets warm, which in Scotland, we're blessed that it's not going to be getting too warm to move around the soil. So we can identify easily where it is, take that away, remediate it with a process, and then begin to develop. And I think this is one of the kind of hidden benefits of developing brownfield sites that as a wider UK we should look at, because otherwise, with the way this site sits, it kind of sits towards the river. So all of this eventually would migrate into the river through time. This will be the same on many sites. And I think the more we develop these sites to get them back to greenfield by funding these sort of innovative projects and encouraging it, the more we'll develop these brownfield sites so that they don't just sit dormant. And I think it was touched on the last presentation that you find kind of the stuff that you did from past where you were just putting things and it was fine and leaving it, it comes back to haunt you. So you might as well, if you know these things exist, get on top of them and turn it into something better. And that's what we're trying to do. So we've got a really good picture of what's going on. We know where the contaminants are, and we've got a plan in place, and we're enacting to make this better. And this all leads on to where we want to go. So our future plans, they're fairly ambitious, but I think with a site of this size, it has to warrant it. It has to be a kind of a big, scary project at first. And then when you eat into it, you realize actually it does make quite a lot of sense. And this is something as a nation, we should really be looking to set up. So this all started because Malin asked to buy the purple shed area, and then we had to purchase all of the rest. So we have phase one planning for all of this area around to the quay. That includes the 120 meter long quay, which, going back to Malin Group's heritage and business use of heavy lift, we're designing that to take 1,000-ton crane or SPMT, so you can move large pieces of ships and large infrastructure across the quayside. So it'll be a purpose-built heavy lift facility, with the first use being Malin, hoping to expand on the work they do at the moment and then run this down to the quay and use this as our heavy lift quay. But then, as I said, out of that became the bigger picture of what else could we do. So we're looking at various kind of shipbuilders, marine electrics, marine hydraulics, anyone in that marine space. If for example, you were going to try and build a new workboat, and again, as Edward touched on before, instead of trying to build new, you try to retrofit, let's say, you could lift the workboat out with the hoist, put it into a shed, take the old generator out, and use the guys on site to repurpose that vessel back on the ship lift and back to sea and back to operations. And the benefit here is you don't have a dry dock, you don't have the space, you don't have the problem with the dry dock that even shipyards will tell you is when you put it on the blocks, that's it. It's a one and done. You're not going to get anyone else in until that one's gone. With this ship hoist, you can facilitate multiple users with one piece. So again, that allows us to work on more vessels and allows more people to be brought onto the site. And we've called it kind of a pop-up shipyard. It's based loosely on the work done in Australia, where they did it on a much bigger scale. But the general idea being, you'd have smaller guys here who would then develop into maybe one of these sheds and into one of these sheds, and it becomes a bit of a circular economy. But they're all around that shipyard marine fabrication element, and all we need is a building and the access to the quay, and then they're away. But also crucially with this, and something I kind of not struggled with, but I think it's as we develop projects like this, councils and governments have to be brought forward to the new way of thinking with renewables and this sort of thing. So when this was first mentioned, I think we had allowed for 4 EV spots. And I asked the question, do you think in 2025, more than 4 people out of the 1,000 employees would drive an electric car? These are the things we need to be thinking about, because it would be pointless for us to build an innovative park and say that by 2025 it's going to have all of this innovation and all of these really good companies on it, but not have any EV charging points, no solar, no wind. So as a business, we've taken a point. The gas main ironically stops at the gate. So we're making a decision not to plumb mains gas into the site. So we're going to be looking at other ways to heat the buildings. Solar's intended on every roof. We're looking at rainwater capture, and I was engaging with Scottish Enterprise last week on a package called Portal, which we were looking at new building practices, thinking along the lines of, if these sheds are fabrication sheds and they're not got huge loads, could you make them out of different materials other than steel? Could you have a wood framed building? Could you look at different ideas for roofing, for cladding, and trying to really design these buildings to be kind of in the thought process of what we think will be around in 2025, 2030. So we're trying to develop now what we think should be in place then. And it's like I've put there, baked into the project. It's kind of in our mindset right away, right from the start. And also around that is the core kind of blue collar, but also the amenities. So things like a nursery, maybe an on-site restaurant, office space, a cafe, things that are going to be expected in the modern workforce. So my background when I left the Navy was shipyards, and shipyards, it's a burger van at best on site. And this doesn't encourage youth and kind of new thinking to come into the industry, because you get there's no services and it doesn't look like a good industry. So along with the innovation, we're looking to bring on the amenities and the softer side of that as well. And the benefits of the project are huge for the area. So the blue line is the land that we own, and the red line is the 1 mile boundary, which represents the 20-minute kind of community. It's kind of, it should really be stressed that the level of unemployment and the deprived nature of that area of Glasgow is, I think it's not the worst in Scotland, but it's not far off the worst in Scotland, and it is crying out for some economic development in the area. This one project, when we ran an economic impact assessment, it showed it would produce £125 million per annum into the local economy and create over 1,200 jobs. So again, it kind of shows that if you have a bit of innovation, you can tackle these brownfield projects and really change the areas that they sit in. We also feel that it's an exciting project. It's going to create a bit of a buzz in the industry and amongst kind of the apprentices and the younger generation to want to get back into shipbuilding. There's a lot of talk of, well, we used to build ships in Glasgow, we can't do it anymore. And it's true, we probably can't build the hulls anymore, but we could definitely add value add and use a lot of the skill set that we have. You know, Strathclyde Uni is one of the best naval architecture universities in the world, and there's not many jobs for the people who leave that university in Glasgow. So if we can provide a place like this, you can really kind of make that circular economy from not just the SMEs, but from the youth employment coming into that as well. But obviously, as I said, it's a big, scary project, and Malin can't fund it all ourselves. So we've took on some key partners. Scottish Enterprise and national government are now seriously looking at this, as they're seeing the rewards of what would be a relatively small government investment. The return to the local economy it's a complete no-brainer. The local authority have been really, really good since we purchased the land. They're aware of the challenges that are on site, and they're very supportive in helping us with planning permission and keeping us kind of on the straight and narrow to get to this development. And Stantec are the same. They design the EIAs and make sure we can actually deliver this project without it just being kind of an altruistic dream. And touching on that, it's not just a dream. So we've had planning approved for a 40-meter high build hall, which was the expansion that Malin wanted to build on. So we have that complete. We have a master plan and our ship recycling license underway, planning for the quay and the funding secured for the quay, so we can start actually developing that and unlocking the land behind it. The first day at 9 acres we're tackling this year. So as the weather's getting warmer, we're looking to get on site in the next couple of weeks and start that, so we can start tackling those black squares that I showed on the slide before. And we recently won the launch contract for the Type 26. So Malin Augustia, which is a separate company, they're bringing the largest semi-submersible dock in Europe to the Clyde, so we can start offloading the Type 26. But by the nature of having that asset on the Clyde, other things are already spinning up out of that, and it's going to be a really useful asset and increase the capability of the park overall. So, as I said, it's kind of a whirlwind tour. There's a lot going on, so I'll just put some kind of facts and figures in of what we're trying to create here. So, 1,000-ton ship hoist, which can take ferries, tugs, and small kind of coastal ships. We've got a large quay. We're looking to get a ship repair business on site. We already have an LOI for one, so that should be coming into the next few months. Marine electrics, hydraulics, and fabrication, like I said, we want to try and get that real hub and that collection of businesses right from the start. And then there's the R&D and Centre of Excellence. So I think, as I touched on before, it's important to kind of get the universities tied in and get that kind of full circle picture going with this sort of project. So it's not just making new bits of machinery, but you're also bringing in the apprentices, you're bringing in the grads as well. And then, yeah, the numbers are fairly substantial. So 83 million, 84 million if you round up as an investment, creating hundreds and hundreds of jobs. And as I said, it's 125 million locally, 65 million for the city economy. So it's, even if you was a government and you put 83 million in full, which obviously we're not going to do, but you would get the 125 straight away to the local economy. So again, these scale projects, I think when you get to the big enough scale where you can have this many jobs, it becomes a bit of a no-brainer. And that is the whistle-stop tour of the Scottish Marine Technology Park.
Fantastic, Sam. What an important project for the world. Wonderful. Thanks very much for that. Now, I know there's questions coming in the chat, and I'm going to hand back to Ian to chair the discussion section of the webinar. Ian.
Okay, thanks, Liz, and thanks very much to our guest panelists for those really interesting presentations. And it's really interesting as well, I think, to see a kind of common thread in Gothenburg and in the Clyde of not just looking at the environmental impact of shipping, but the kind of local, kind of ecological impact from the port and shipyard operations. So if anyone would like to ask any questions for the panelists, can I ask you to raise your hand and turn your video on? Or if you prefer not to speak out loud, you can submit the questions in the chat feature. And I have a question that was submitted earlier on to Edvard from Imogen Humphreys. And Imogen is saying, could you talk a little about the other partners you work with and the challenges of persuading them to get on board and change behaviour? How do you go about these conversations to get them on board with the idea of making large-scale investments that may not deliver tangible financial benefit in the short term? Is it purely reliant on complying to policy, or are people ignited by your sustainability vision?
Oh, thank you for that question. I would say that it's a different approach for different actors. With some of them, we have contracts, so we can sort of use the contract way and the lease agreements to put pressure on them. Sometimes we have to go in more of the carrot rather than the whip. And traditionally, what we've done is that we provide discounts to ship owners. We're now discussing on doing that on the land side as well. And these discounts in themselves will rarely be enough to make an actual change. But what we've seen is that if we provide a discount and then the actors can take this in their hand and go to somewhere else, knock on their door and say, hey, Port of Gothenburgers, they're giving us a discount because we're sustainable. Could you also help us by giving us a discount or helping us in some other way? And by opening the first door, we sort of help the development to go in that directions. So just the little things can make a difference. Then, of course, it used to be the bottom line, just like you said in the question, regulation. And we tend to say today, like we've said before, that it's now changing and people are more interested in the sustainability vision. But then again, we've said that before, we're always hoping positively to see the change coming, that everyone wants to be sustainable. I do think that a large chunk of the shipping business is still bottom line regulations. They keep it there. And the challenge today is really that we have such a wide variety between players. We have some shipping lines and actors in the marine business which are really visionary and have come really, really far. And then we have the other end that haven't come anywhere. And today we are sort of switching in Gothenburg from helping the ones that have come the furthest to try and bring along the ones that have come the shortest way so far. So we need to get everybody on board. That's the challenge today. What we also do is that we have worked quite hard to create a reputation as Port Authority, and that can really be any type of authority or entity. We create a brand and reputation as being sustainable. We can then help others by letting them use our brand and our reputation when they apply for funding. So if you apply for funding from a national level, European level, or from any type of innovation funds, you need to have the strong brand. So we create our brand, we make it strong, and then we let others use it in order to make funding available for them. That is one way of helping others and sort of move the discussion in the right direction. Thanks.
A question for Sam. It's about the level and extent of support you've had from the local authority for the SMTP development. Have they been quite actively involved in it?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's always that problem when you have to put the money where the mouth is, right? So it's a good idea. Everyone can see it's a good idea. And then you ask for some money, you're always going to have a little bit of kind of pushback. But the buy-in at the minute, especially from the SE and the government side, has been in the last few weeks, even it's just kind of ramped up again and again and again. And they're looking at kind of business cases and less kind of tell us about it and how much do you want? And okay, it sounds like a good idea. How would we actually fund it? You know, what's the mechanism? What bits could we do? What bits couldn't we do? How would it all work? So yeah, it's definitely coming on. But I think it is a big project, and you're not talking kind of 100 grand isn't going to help. 200 grand is not going to help. Malin, I think, has spent around over £2 million of their money in site investigations and reports and planning and all of that to get us to where we are now. So you've got to be putting in sizable chunks, and obviously government sign off on sizable chunks isn't the quickest, but no, the buy-in is definitely that's really encouraging as well, as we kind of, because as the government buy-in and the private investment comes, you can talk with more clarity and assurance to the businesses and say, this is going to happen. You can have that plot. And that kind of then becomes a self-fulfilling beast, because the more businesses we get, the better it is for the private guys, better it is for the public fund. So it all starts to kind of get rolling. And we've really seen that over the last couple of months. It's sort of gathered quite a lot of steam. So yeah, I'm happy at the minute.
Good, thanks, Sam. And we have a question in the chat from Richard Emsley, and this is for Edvard. And he's asking, how do you see the replacement new fuels for fossil fuels evolving? How will you crack the chicken and egg problem? Who will want a particular new fuel? And how do you plan ahead when you don't know which are going to be required?
Thank you. That's the $100 question. It's a tough one. It's really something that we've been discussing back and forth, and the chicken and egg has been a standard answer to that for a long time. What we do in Gothenburg, and I see many other ports and actors are doing the same thing, is that to crack the problem, you have to involve everybody. So you basically have to create pilot projects that includes a ship owner who's using the fuel, a fuel provider who's providing the fuel, and the port authority in the middle, making it possible to bunker that fuel within the port to the specific user. And ideally, of course, we would like to have several ship owners and several providers, but normally today we are satisfied if we can get one ship owner and one bunker supplier. And we've done that in a couple of cases when it comes to onshore power supply in the same way. We're now doing it on battery together with Stena Line, and we are planning on doing the same thing with hydrogen with a couple of other ship owners. So basically, create pilot projects where you have one actor from each segment on board together so that you're all stepping ahead at the same time. That's the best way to solve it. Thanks.
Good, thank you. And Robert McCaig would like to ask a question for Edward on the video chat.
Yes, good morning, Edward. Very interesting presentation around the port of Gothenburg. About 20 years ago, I mentioned to Ian McGilvray, about 20 years ago, I had the pleasure of visiting Gothenburg, and I was carrying out a consultative exercise based on alternative fuels at that time. And I was involved in 2 visits in Gothenburg. One was to the Volvo truck plant. At that time, Volvo were very much in the forefront of developing LNG-powered engines for their trucks, and also for the Gothenburg local authority area. At that time, the local authority area were really featuring very heavily on the use of compressed natural gas, CNG. Effectively, as you know, CNG and LNG are the same. It's the same gas. One is liquefied, the other is compressed. But I noted that around the local authority area, virtually all of the refuse collection vehicles, the public authority bus service, many of the taxis, and in fact, many of the local residents of Gothenburg were actually using compressed natural gas. So my question to you is the use of compressed natural gas something that you have thought about in terms of the various pieces of plant and equipment and transport accessing and exiting the port authority? Given that there seems to be, unless of course it's been disbanded somewhat, there seems to be a fairly strong influence from the use of CNG in Gothenburg already.
Thank you very much, Robert. I hope you appreciated your visit to Gothenburg. Always nice to have visitors. LNG and CNG has been very high on the agenda in Gothenburg for quite some time, and you're correct there. What has happened in the last few years is that we actually tried to get in place an LNG terminal within the port of Gothenburg, and there's been 2 attempts. Both have unfortunately failed. The first one due to the political debate, and the second time due to the business case. And the problem here is that LNG has been a strong case as a future fuel due to the fact that you get less air emissions. The problem is LNG is not good enough when it comes to the climate change. It's still a fossil fuel, and we need larger reductions than what we can achieve with LNG. Therefore, the city has moved away from LNG, and we're now looking at electrification instead. So you have a lot of electrified buses and trucks within the city of Gothenburg. At the same time, there has been some attempts to look at liquefied biogas instead, but we simply don't have enough of the biogas to also see to the vessels and so on. But we do have a number of vessels that switched to LNG, and the problem there is that they are now in the phase that they might be looking at stranded assets if we move away from LNG as a future fuel. And this is a huge debate just starting on the international level when it comes to LNG for shipping. But on the local level in Gothenburg, we've already taken the step away from natural gas and moved to electrification. And I would say that we are moving further in that direction in the coming years. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, do we have any more questions from delegates? A question I'd like to ask for Edvard is, what kind of level of support and investment have you had from the Swedish government and the EU for taking forward your sustainability aims?
What type of investments?
Yeah, what level of investment have you had from the Swedish government and the EU?
Well, we've asked for all kinds of funding, and I would say that the the level of investment has been different depending on what we applied for. We actually applied for tens of millions of euros for an LNG terminal, the one that for political reasons was never built. But what we see today is a lot of small fundings. So we get funding for charging posts for electrical cars, onshore power supply for vessels and so on. But it's usually in the area of up to about £1 million, roughly, for each and every application. But there's a lot of different applications at the same time. Then, of course, we have some large EU-funded projects going on, but then we would not be the main authority within that project. We would be one of the brands that put our logo on it to make it more reputable, basically. But then we're talking up to 100 million euros.
Okay, good, thank you. And I have a question in the chat from Ken Farnhill, and this is for both panelists. He's asking, how do you try to ensure that the land with access to the water is available for maritime uses? It seems like we've lost a lot, especially on the Clyde, to other uses and ignored the needs of the maritime industry. Sam, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. It is a good question. It highlights the kind of the problem we spoke about right at the start of you lose the shipyard, you lose it, and you end up putting houses on the Clyde instead. I think the best way to ensure it is work closely with people like Pillport, who own a lot of land in and around the Clyde, work with the Port Authority in general to kind of let them see the importance of it. I think then when you put that into the government picture and the local authority picture, that you see the use and the amount of revenue it's going to generate for the local economy, it becomes a thing where you have to enable access. You have to ensure that the channel's dredged, if you like, right to the quayside. You have to make sure the facilities are in place for the thing that you've potentially funded to create, to keep existing. So I think when you get to something of this scale, that's the way you make sure you do it. I think if you get similar to what Edvard said, you bring everyone to the table and you walk forward together. You don't kind of go out on your own and say, this is my project and we'll crack on, thanks. You got to pull everybody together and get them to see the bigger picture. So it's key for us at Malin. We're talking, we had a key stakeholder day in the Rotunda when we was able to, and we had, ministers, local MPs and things come down, Port Authority guys, and say, this is what we want to do. We're not going to be kind of blocking. We don't want to take business away from other areas further down the Clyde, but equally this thing is going to exist and it is going to exist in this way. How do we ensure that happens, that everybody, everybody's happy and everybody can work around it? So it's kind of cliche, but I think the collaboration element when you're talking about these sort of projects is crucial.
Okay, thanks, Edvard.
Well, besides agreeing to what Samuel described, I would have to admit that in our case, we basically gave up and left the city center, because what we've done is that we've moved the port area and the maritime business further and further away from the city center as housing and the other type of development has grown. And at the same time, we have to admit that we're actually filling out a bay within the port area to get access to more land. So instead of fighting for the available land, we're building new land. That's the simple answer. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, I have one more question, Ian. I was just about typing it there, but it's probably quicker to deal with it just on video. It's another question for Edvard, just following up from his last explanation of Gothenburg city and port, realizing that LNG and of course CNG is perhaps not the most environmentally friendly solution going forward in the long term. And of course there is distribution issues on LNG, not just in Gothenburg, but in many other parts of the world, including here in Scotland, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. However, given that I was quite surprised that Gothenburg as a local authority have have moved away from CNG in that respect, because whilst it might not be the most environmentally friendly solution in the longer term, at least with CNG versus LNG, CNG removes the likelihood of what you described as a stranded asset, Edward, because effectively a port authority or a local authority are in complete control of the production of the compressed natural gas. You would not be reliant on a distribution network. So I'm wondering if was that a reason why? Is it the only reason that CNG was dismissed was because of the environmental reasons, or was it dismissed because it wasn't practical to produce CNG on site in Gothenburg?
I would describe it actually as CNG has always been seen as environmentally friendly because it does remove a lot of the air emissions and the particles. The problem has really been the climate issue. Natural gas is fossil fuels should be removed, and that has been the baseline for the politicians. So that has been the reason behind why we remove more and more of the CNG trucks. We still have a lot of them in operations, but for the new ones, we aim for electricity. So it's basically just a question of climate and fossil fuels being removed.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions from delegates? A question I have for Sam, a kind of point to raise, is that it strikes me that there's actually been environmental benefits from developing the SMTP site compared to just leaving it as it was because of all the hydrocarbon contamination that was there. And obviously with climate change, rising sea levels, in future there could be greater potential for that to leak into the river and cause contamination in that way. Have you had kind of input and support from SEPA for the project on that specific issue?
Yeah, 100%. As I said in the presentation, the site kind of slopes toward the river, so anything at the back will eventually come through. So yeah, we've had a lot of chat on that. In the case of, again, kind of touching on Edvard's point, we always build things right next to birds and animals. Right across from our site is a triple SI bird sanctuary. So anything coming out of the site into the river is just naturally going to go across. So we've had to bear that in mind for everything, you know, construction, diggers, noise, all of the normal things. But yeah, SEPA have been crucial. They're almost a key partner, to be honest, in the fact that obviously they have the legislation, they have to be keeping an eye on making sure we're doing things properly, but they're also kind of their understanding of the project, the timescales and what we're looking to do. So it's not a case of, you know, they're banging the drum saying you must do this today. They understand the way that we're working through it. But I think, yeah, it just highlights the point, you know, if you've got these brownfield sites, instead of developers and things trying to fund it themselves, I mean, if we did this ourselves as a private project, it wouldn't work. There's a gap funding to make it wash its face for private funding. To get enough return on the investment out of it, you need some sort of government help to plug the gap. And I think I know there's the regeneration grants and things going around at the minute, but I think if the government really kind of made a beeline for that and really kind of helped any developers looking to get into that space, we've found SEPA to be really receptive. I imagine most local authorities will be really receptive to more revenue and more income coming into the local area. So we're kind of using this as a bit of a showcase that if we can do it here with the hydrocarbon contamination we've got right opposite a bird sanctuary, then there will be other sites that it is able to be done, and you can sort of see that into the years to come, I think.
So you've essentially been able to take forward a test case with it on that.
Basically, and I think that adds to the kind of the national shipbuilding strategy and a lot of the offshore and the offshore wind. You know, if we can prove that you could theoretically buy a hull from abroad, ship it here, fit it out, build a new workboat, or retrofit some of the aquaculture vessels, you know, these things are 30 years old and they're being asked to comply with the new regulations. They can only do that by putting batteries on board, and they can only do that by retrofits. But there's hardly anywhere on the west coast of Scotland where you can do battery retrofit of a workboat. So you've got the pressures from government telling these guys you have to do this, but they've got nowhere to do it. And then it goes back to, as Edvard said with the shippers, like my background is marine shipping. Shipping companies won't do anything unless they're told by regulation to do it, and they'll do it on the day before the regulation comes in. So if you enable these people and you give them help and you give them discounts and you give them kind of the funding they need, people will move. I think you just need to kind of lower the gates, help people actually get into it instead of just saying, well, this is a regulation and away you go.
Okay, thank you. And another question I have for both Sam and Edvard, do you see potential for the developments that you're taking forward to support offshore renewable energy as well as the shipbuilding and the shipping industries?
Yeah, I mean, from our side, 100%. Given where we are on the west coast, there's quite a lot of noise at the minute on tidal. Offshore wind packages are coming to the floor. The space requirement's probably a bit too big for our site, but we could definitely accommodate tidal. We've got some test projects going through Malin at the minute with some wave swings and some quite innovative stuff. So yeah, I think this is one of the perks of the site. It's so big and there's so much different things you can do with it. Aquaculture support, vessel building and renewables it's just going to come out as we develop the project and as you get the SMEs on board.
Okay, thanks. And Edvard, have anything to add to that from your point of view?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to say that personally, I think that the potential is excellent and that we should see more projects into that direction, especially when it comes to energy and use of wind. Unfortunately, in my previous job, I was a consultant and I did some risk analysis for wind farms just outside the port of Gothenburg within the Fairway Inn, and that was stopped from various ship owners that saw too many risks. Not that it would actually be a risk that the windmills would fall into the fairway, but the conception that they might was enough to stop this wind farm. So it's been really difficult to get this type of projects going in the Gothenburg area. But the potential is there, and I sincerely hope that we will get there in the future. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And another question for Sam and possibly for Edvard as well is what level of engagement and support have you had from the local community in terms of where you're developing the SMTP and also where you're expanding the ports away from the city centre?
Yeah, I mean, we've tried to engage locally. I think that's probably our hardest thing we're up against at the minute is trying to get the kind of the investment and the benefit conveyed across to the local population. I think we've done quite a good job in the local authority, but yeah, it's something we really want to work on with the actual kind of boots on the ground, the guys that live right next door, and trying to tell them of the benefits and what we're trying to do. You get quite a lot of dog walkers and things around on the site. It's a big kind of green forested area, so you get a lot of people walking around, and you talk to them and tell them about it, and they're all very exciting. So we're kind of taking that feedback and then trying to push that out via kind of LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram and that sort of thing, trying to just get the information out so people can consume it and understand it. But I think as the more the project goes, the more we'll have to have kind of public consultation and get the local people in. We want to add part of the Clyde Mission Fund was to build a big nature walk that links the canal with the river, and that's something we're really passionate about doing. So we want to kind of engage with the local community and say, aside from us putting a wooden walkway and some signs up, is there anything else you'd want in that walkway? Is there anything else within the park you'd like? We've got to put a lot of suds basins, a lot of ponded areas. So, is there any way we can kind of engage you guys with that? And I think there's that softer benefit as well. If people are coming down and they're seeing big bits of ships being swung around and they're seeing the kind of the goings on in the park, that might inspire, a kid walking his dog to think, actually, I want to get into that when I get older. I want to be part of that. And you kind of get the softer side of it as well. So it is something we're aware of, but yeah, we do need to get better at that. But that's our take anyway.
Okay, thank you, Edvard.
I would say that's one of the most important issues that we've overseen through the development of moving out from the city center, because what we see over the decades where the port has moved from the city center to the outskirts of the city is that the average citizen of Gothenburg has got less and less knowledge about the port. They don't even know where it's located. And a lot of the citizens, when we ask them, what do you know about the port and where it's situated, would point in the wrong direction and talk about one of the cruise vessels that have come into the city center. They have no idea that we have the largest port in Scandinavia just outside the city. But that's due to the fact that we've moved away from the city center and tried to sort of divide it into industrial areas and port areas and city areas on the other hand. So we're trying effectively to keep the two apart, and that has in turn made it difficult for the average citizen to know what's going on. So now we are trying at the same time to keep it apart because we don't want the citizens to disturb the actual operations, which is often the problem if you're too close. But at the same time, we want them to know about the port. So we have to spend more and more money and time on information campaigns to keep the average citizen informed about what's going on. And at the same time, we need to remember that we are actually, even though Port of Gothenburg Authority employs only 150 people, the port as such employs between 1,500 and 8,000 people. And we then have 22,000 people approximately in our calculations who are working within jobs that are dependent on the port. So tens of thousands of people are dependent on the port being there, but not that many people know about the importance of it. So it continuous information, really important. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And I have a question in the chat from Lindsay Barr, and Lindsay is asking Sam, have you engaged with the local schools as the children could develop projects that would help spread the word from the ground up?
Yeah, we have. We ran as Malin Group a project called the Young Engineers, where we went around to various schools around the park, but also around kind of the wider Glasgow area, and handed out packs that had kind of engineering challenges of, you know, see how much Lego you could pick up using spaghetti and tape and that sort of thing to build winches and get them involved in engineering projects and make it fun. Yeah, we actually got really, really good feedback from it. But yeah, it's on our radar, Lindsay. We want to really get into the schools. Like I said, I really want to encourage the guys and girls to go down and see it. I'd actually said to our construction guys, like, is it possible to get school kids down to see them actually constructing stuff? You know, not in the diggers driving it, but at least seeing it, because it's kind of one of those things. You drive past a development site, but you've got no idea what's going on, the number of roles that's included, and it just feels a bit kind of counterintuitive. We say, oh, we're going to create 600 construction jobs, but then we put a massive fence around it and tell no one they can come in. And it's like, but then you want people to get into construction. So you need to, there needs to be some give. So yeah, we're aware of the schools. Like I said, kind of local engagement's big on my agenda at the minute. I really want to, now we've got our funding progressing. Now we've got some tenants as damn as near it signed up. We want to really push that so we can kind of get that one running as well.
Good, thank you. And I have kind of one more question for Sam. And obviously the site location, as you mentioned in the presentation, you're right next to the Firth and Clyde Canal. Have you looked at the potential for canal boats and using the canal as kind of inland transport waterway?
Yeah, we looked at that. I think that was done quite early on in the, I can't remember the name of the study, but they do quite a lot of studies to see what the impact would be on the other routes, the transport routes. And as far as I'm aware, we can't use the canal in almost a literal point of view. We can't use it to actually ship up and down anymore. But there's definitely, we could repair and provide maintenance for those canal boats very, very easily. So I think we'd take the marine element on of that aspect and then leave the transport, because as far as I'm aware, it's only used for leisure at the moment anyway, and some of it's in, you know, it's on an upgrade with Scottish Canals are doing a big funding package to upgrade it all to make it more usable.
Yeah. There's one thing you see certainly on the canals in England is quite a lot of people are living on canal boats on the canals. Although it's kind of taking off a bit on the Firth and Clyde Canal, it's still, you don't see that much of it on the canals in Scotland. And what about also the potential for kind of river buses, passenger transport on the river? Is there potential for these kind of vessels to moor at the park?
Yeah, 100%. We was
Stuart there.
Yeah, well, we were actually involved with a conversation with a guy who wanted to retrofit. Basically, I don't know if you've been to London, the Thames river boats, that style riverboat, and making it either hydrogen or electric powered and run it down to Jamaica Quay down in centre of Glasgow.
Yeah.
So that was something that was being kind of muted around, but it's also, we were looking at providing almost like a hydrogen bus or an electric bus to go from Old Kilpatrick train station into the site and around the site and out. So again, trying to link up that renewable thought process that, you know, the 20-minute neighborhood, everyone might not want to walk. They're going to be using trains, they're going to be using buses and bikes. So kind of trying to build that into it, making sure the footpaths are wide enough for bikes and people, and that sort of stuff involved heavily in development at the moment.
Okay, good, thanks. Well, we're almost out of time now, but if there's any more questions from the audience, we can perhaps take one or two. No, doesn't look like it. And certainly we've covered quite a lot of detail and ground in the actual presentations themselves today. So just to wrap up, if you'd like to find out more information about our speakers and their organisations, that's the portofgothenburg.com for the Gothenburg Port Authority and malingroup.com for Malin Group. And if you have any further questions or you'd like to get in touch and find out more about our webinar series, these are our contact details. And we also have a LinkedIn group for Clyde Sustainable Shipping for anyone who's interested in joining. And also we'll be adding the recording of the webinar online shortly at clyde.scot/countdown26. And again, this is the schedule for the upcoming webinars. The next webinar is scheduled for the 11th of May. That was postponed from March, and that will be looking at vessel design and build. And of course, we've touched briefly on the potential for passenger and river transport in the discussion today, and we'll have a webinar specifically on that topic later on in May. So thank you all for coming along today, and thanks so much again to our guest panelists for the really informative presentations. And we hope to see you all again.
Thank you very much.
Webinars.
Yeah, thanks guys, appreciate it.
Thanks everyone, and thanks to you for organising it, Ian, as ever. Thank you.